I've been waiting for an hour already. Can you please just let me through?
I understand, but I need you to remain here until the area is cleared. I apologize for the inconvenience.
Don't move. Hands up. Now. That voice echoed across the square in front of the federal building. Cold and authoritative. The man in front froze, not out of fear, but because he couldn't obey the command. "Officer, I'm in a wheelchair. I'm a disabled veteran." I said, "Don't move. Stay still and follow instructions." "I can't reach. I can't stand. Please look at my medals." Those weren't a plea. They were the explanation of a man who had served this country. The entire moment, every word, every glance, every small movement was clearly captured by surveillance cameras at 923 a.m. Tuesday, and therefore, no one could deny the truth of what happened next. The man in the wheelchair was Robert Hayes. He was a veteran, having served in 3 overseas campaigns. An IED explosion in Afghanistan had robbed him of his ability to walk, but it had also earned him the Purple Heart, a medal for those wounded in combat for their country. That morning, Robert wasn't here to protest. He wasn't here to argue. He was simply here to update his veterans' benefits paperwork, something he'd done many times before without any trouble. He wore a neat shirt and a well-tailored jacket. On his lapel, the Purple Heart gleamed in the morning sun, a reminder that this man had paid a heavy price to be called an American citizen. Robert believed in the system. He believed that serving his country would earn him at least a minimum of respect. He had no idea that, in just a few minutes, that belief would be crushed right outside a federal building, because the person approaching him at that moment didn't see a veteran, didn't see a disabled person. They only saw a suspicious subject. And from that moment, a chain of mistakes, abuses of power, and violence would begin, leading to a $17 million verdict. And a question that would confront the entire nation. How could a war hero become a victim of the very country he once served? Before becoming the man in the wheelchair outside the federal building that morning, Robert Hayes was a soldier any unit would want. 3 overseas deployments, hundreds of days in combat zones, and once, in Afghanistan, everything changed in a matter of seconds. The convoy had just turned off a dirt road when an improvised explosive device detonated. The blast ripped the vehicle apart. Robert woke up in a field hospital, feeling nothing in his legs. The explosion robbed him of his ability to walk, but also earned him the Purple Heart, a medal no one desires, but only for those who have truly shed blood for their country. Upon returning to America, Robert faced another battle. No more gunfire, but months of physical therapy, sleepless nights filled with pain, and the haunting question, who am I when I can no longer stand? Robert didn't let that question defeat him. He learned to live in a wheelchair. He learned to transfer himself from bed to chair. He learned to drive the modified wheelchair, now controlled by his hands. Every little thing was a victory. He married Maria, the woman who had been by his side through his darkest days. They had 2 young children, and for Robert, being a good father became his new mission. That morning, before leaving home, Maria reminded him, "Finish the paperwork and come home early." Robert smiled. He thought it would be a normal morning. Park the car. Transfer to the wheelchair. Go into the building. Sign some papers. Then go home. Nothing in his plan included being surrounded by 4 federal agents, or lying motionless on the concrete for hours afterward. As Robert slowly rolled across the square, he carried no fear. He carried with him the belief that the country he had served would not turn its back on him. But on the other side of the square, there was a man watching him with a very different gaze. A gaze that saw no war, No sacrifice. No medals. Only something that he considered out of place. And that very gaze would steer this story in a direction no one could have imagined. The man approaching Robert was Agent Samuel Torres. Torres had worked in immigration enforcement for 6 years. Not a rookie. Not a novice in power. That morning, he had been assigned to stand outside the federal building as part of what was called enhanced security protocols, a term that sounded serious. But no one had explained exactly what it meant. There was no clear list, no clear criteria, only a vague directive: watch out for suspicious people. And the problem was, when the law doesn't clearly define what suspicious is, personal biases would override the law. From across the square, Torres saw Robert, a black man, in a wheelchair, slowly approaching the federal building entrance during office hours. No running, no dodging. He carried nothing but a briefcase, and yet Torres walked out. Later, in his reports, he would have difficulty explaining what it was about Robert that made him feel uneasy. Because, in fact, nothing in Robert's behavior met any threatening criteria. But Torres had worked too long in an environment where feeling was often valued more than reason. He adjusted his body armor. His hand unconsciously touching his belt buckle. And strode quickly toward Robert. With the gait of someone accustomed to giving orders, and accustomed to being obeyed. Robert noticed the approach. But he wasn't worried. He'd been in buildings like this many times before. He believed this was just a routine check. Torres stopped in front of him. No proper greeting. No explanation. There was only a short, dry command. Stop. Show me your papers. Robert nodded, reaching for his jacket to get his wallet exactly as he had been asked. And that very moment of complete cooperation became the pretext for things to start spiraling out of control. For in Torres's mind, the story was already written, and Robert, unknowingly, had been cast as the suspect from the very first second. Robert had just reached into his jacket pocket when Torres's voice suddenly changed. Don't reach for it. The volume rose. The voice was harsh. The entire square seemed to freeze for a breath. Robert froze. I'm getting my papers as you asked. But that explanation was meaningless now. In Torres's mind, the act of reaching for the wallet was no longer cooperative. It had become a suspicious movement. Torres moved closer. The personal distance vanished. His hand grabbed Robert's wrist, squeezing tightly. Keep your hands where I can see them. Robert felt the grip. Not painful, but insulting. Sir, I'm not reaching for a weapon. I can't stand. I'm a veteran. He tried to keep his voice calm, as he used to do with panicked soldiers under fire. But Torres wasn't listening. He pressed the intercom button. Suspicious subject. Uncooperative. That was the first lie. Robert looked around. Several people began to slow their pace. The atmosphere shifted from normal to tense in seconds. Uncooperative, Robert asked. His voice still calm. You asked for papers. I'm getting them. Torres didn't answer. Instead, he stepped aside, assuming a controlling posture, the posture of someone who had decided the other person was the problem. Just a few minutes later, 3 more appeared. Rodriguez, Foster, Kim, 4 federal agents, a man in a wheelchair. Rodriguez looked Robert up and down. What are you doing here? Robert handed over the envelope of papers. I have an appointment. I'm here to update my veterans' benefits. Rodriguez glanced at the envelope so quickly he barely read it. Torres spoke, his voice firm. He was behaving suspiciously. I asked him to stop, but he didn't comply. A second lie was told in front of a witness. Robert began to realize this was no longer a routine check. This was a staged scenario. And he, though completely innocent, had been cast as the troublemaker. He asked a simple, legitimate question. "Please tell me, why am I being held?" No one answered directly. Only cold stares. Stations were adjusted, and a very clear feeling that things were spiraling out of control. Their motives were revealed when they no longer asked, "Who are you?" but "Where do you belong?" Rodriguez broke the silence. "Are you an American citizen?" The question weighed more heavily than any previous command. Rodriguez blinked, clearly disbelieving his ears. I'm a veteran. I served in the United States Army." Torres smirked. "Prove it." Rodriguez slowly pulled out his veteran's badge, then pointed directly at the purple heart pinned to his lapel. "Is this metal enough?" Rodriguez glanced at it and uttered a sentence that froze the atmosphere. "It could be fake." Several people around him froze. Some muttered, "Unbelievable." For Robert, that moment hurt even more than the earlier wrist squeeze. Because it made one thing very clear: they didn't want to believe anything that contradicted their initial assumptions. Foster took half a step forward. "What are you doing here?" "I already said. I have an appointment. Veterans Benefits Papers." Kim interrupted. "What are you carrying?" Robert began to feel what so many black people in America had experienced when every explanation was dismissed as a lie. And every piece of evidence was deemed insufficient. At that moment, Robert made an instinctive decision, a decision that would later change the entire course of events. He pulled out his phone. "I'll record this. This is a public place. You are officers." The moment the phone was raised, the agent's attitude changed instantly. Torres snarled, "Put the phone down. Now." "I have the right to record," Robert replied, his voice still calm. "I'm not resisting. I just want to know what I did wrong." Foster immediately moved aside, deliberately blocking the camera. Kim looked around, as if calculating his next move. Rodriguez crossed his arms, his voice cold. "You're causing trouble and obstructing the mission." Robert didn't budge. He remained in his wheelchair, still speaking in a steady, slow voice. But now, in their eyes, he was no longer the person to be checked. He had become something far more dangerous, a man who dared to record the truth. And from that moment, this confrontation was no longer about security, but about power and who controlled the narrative. Escalating. When resistance is based on self-defense. Kim made the first move. He bent down, reaching for the pouch hanging from the side of his wheelchair, as if it were the obvious thing to do. Robert reacted immediately, not violently, but verbally. "You have no right to search me. I haven't done anything wrong." That statement, a perfectly legitimate declaration, became the perfect excuse. Torres immediately shouted, "You're resisting." Robert instinctively gripped the wheelchair's armrest, not to attack, but to avoid being pulled down from the only thing that kept him standing in life. Torres grabbed Robert's left arm and yanked hard. "Let go." Robert cried out, his voice already trembling. "I can't stand. I'm paralyzed." But that explanation didn't stop them. On the contrary, it was interpreted as disobedience. Rodriguez stepped behind the wheelchair, gripping the push handles with both hands, pulling the wheelchair off course. That action caused Robert to lose his balance. The phone in his hand fell to the concrete, the screen still facing upwards, continuing to record the sounds of everything happening. "Stop!" someone in the crowd shouted. People around began to gather. Another person yelled, "He's in a wheelchair. What are you doing?" Instead of calming down, The agents became even more tense. Torres pressed the radio again. Need more support. Subject resisting. That was the third lie uttered while Robert remained seated in his wheelchair. Foster stepped to Robert's right. Torres held him firmly on the left. The two stood in a position anyone who had ever watched corporal training would recognize the ready-to-contain posture. Robert looked up at them, his gaze not defiant but bewildered. "I did nothing wrong," he said. "Please, just tell me why I'm being held." No one answered. Only tighter gripping hands, adjusting footwork, and a terrifying silence number when everyone around sensed that something terrible was about to happen. And when the final limit of reason was crossed, this would no longer be just words. The climax, when violence erupts in front of every camera. That moment lasted less than a second. Torres and Foster glanced at each other without a word. They had made their decision. Two hands simultaneously pulled Robert out of the wheelchair, as if he could stand, as if his body didn't bear permanent injuries. But Robert couldn't stand. Gravity did the rest. His body lost its balance, was slammed violently onto the concrete floor, while the wheelchair tipped over. The sound of metal hitting the ground was deafening. Papers rained down, and then a small, purple object rolled out of Robert's lapel and lay sprawled on the cement floor. Purple Heart. The sight caused the crowd to erupt. "Stop. Oh my God. He's a veteran. Are you guys crazy?" Robert lay on the ground, his body twisted in an unnatural position. His head hit the ground hard. Blood began to trickle down his forehead. His breathing was rapid and heavy. His left arm was bent at the wrong angle, an angle anyone could see was wrong. The agents stood around, breathing heavily, as if they had just subdued a dangerous man. Torres looked down at Robert, his chest heaving with adrenaline. No weapons were found. There had been no attack from Robert. Only a disabled man had been knocked down in front of dozens of witnesses. Robert's phone lay a few meters away. The screen still lit. It was no longer recording video, but it was still recording audio, the panicked screams of the crowd, the shouts of the agents, and the pained groans of its owner. A woman rushed through the crowd, kneeling beside Robert. "I'm a nurse," she yelled. "He's seriously injured. Call an ambulance immediately." Torres turned, his voice cold. "Step back. The scene isn't safe." Not safe. Before them lay a veteran motionless on the ground, his war medals mixed in with the dirt, being kicked around like a worthless object. That moment captured from many different angles, by security cameras and passers-by's phones, would soon be on every major American news headline. And it raises a question no one can avoid. What gives those in power the right to treat a war hero in such a way in broad daylight? In public. Immediate consequences. When the truth begins to counteract, Robert lay motionless on the concrete, his breath ragged as if the air around him had been sucked away. The impact had stunned him, the world before his eyes blurring in waves. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry, only a few weak sounds escaping. The woman who identified herself as a nurse didn't wait for permission. She knelt beside Robert, carefully placing her hand on his shoulder. "Can you hear me?" Robert only managed a very slight nod. She looked at his left arm number bent at an unnatural angle number, then looked up at the agents with a mixture of horror and indignation. "He needs an ambulance immediately." Torres stood there, his voice strained. "We'll handle the medical treatment later. The scene isn't under control yet." But before the sentence could finish, a deep, decisive voice rang out from the entrance of the building. "No. You'll call emergency services. Right now." Everyone turned. A man in a captain's uniform walked quickly toward the crowd. It was Lieutenant Colonel James Washington. He had just seen Purple Heart lying on the ground, and his expression had completely changed. Washington pulled out his military ID and held it straight up in front of the agents. "I am an active duty officer," he said, slowly but unmistakably. "Why is a wounded veteran lying on the ground in front of this building?" Rodriguez replied curtly, "This is a federal investigation. You're not involved." Washington looked her straight in the eye. "A veteran assaulted in front of my workplace that concerns me." He knelt beside Robert, speaking in a voice only those who had commanded in wartime could muster. "You're here. I'm here with you. Relief is coming." Robert opened his eyes, whispering, "I just came to update my allowance." That brief sentence silenced even the toughest men in the crowd. Finally, an ambulance was called. 15 minutes passed for Robert. Those 15 minutes felt like hours on the cold ground. When the paramedics began their examination, Torres made another grave mistake. He told the paramedics that Robert resisted arrest and may have been under the influence of stimulants. That lie was uttered in front of dozens of witnesses and in front of a military officer who was taking note of every word. At this moment, what had once been shielded by insignia and power began to crack, because from this moment on, things were no longer under their control. The hospital and the media storm when the truth cannot be silenced. The ambulance door closed, cutting Robert off from the square, but not cutting off what had happened there. Inside the ambulance, flashing lights reflected on his pale face. Medical staff performed a quick check: head injury, unstable breathing, a visibly swollen and deformed left arm. One of the paramedics, a former soldier number, glanced at Robert's identification bracelet and shook her head slightly. "Stay calm, buddy," she said. "We'll take care of the rest." Lieutenant Colonel Washington sat in the ambulance, keeping his eyes fixed on Robert. He made sure no one could distort the testimony of someone in a state of severe shock. At the hospital, doctors quickly took Robert for a CT scan. The results were not good. Moderate concussion, 2 fractured ribs, a broken left arm requiring surgery to fix it. For someone who had already lost both legs, the additional loss of the ability to use an arm was not just painful, it was a direct blow to their independence. While Robert was being treated, outside the hospital, another storm was brewing. Videos from the square began appearing on social media. Security camera footage, passers-by's phones, screaming sounds, images of a wheelchair user being knocked over. Within hours, these videos spread across all platforms. By evening, national news channels were reporting on the incident. The headline stunned millions: "Disabled veteran tackled by federal agents outside federal building." Meanwhile, Maria, Robert's wife, was at work when she received a call from the hospital. She thought it was a traffic accident. She never imagined that her war-surviving husband would be knocked out by his own country's agency. When Maria rushed to the hospital, Robert was receiving painkillers, his eyes closed, his left arm in a cast, and a heart monitor wrapped around him. She grasped his right hand, the only hand he could still move, and burst into tears. "What happened to you?" she whispered. Outside that room, public opinion was already boiling. Veterans organizations called it a national disgrace. Congressmen demanded an explanation, and those who had previously remained silent started asking the same question. If this could happen to a Purple Heart recipient, who among us is safe? The legal battle begins. When justice doesn't come, you have to seek it. The next morning, when Robert woke up in his hospital room, The first thing he saw wasn't the stark white ceiling, but his Purple Heart medal neatly placed on the bedside table. It had been cleaned of dust, no longer lying on the cold concrete floor, but the image of it falling to the ground was still vivid in Robert's mind. The man who brought the medal was Lieutenant Colonel James Washington. He stood beside the hospital bed, his voice low. "What happened to you wasn't just wrong," he said. "It was a violation of the law." Then he placed a business card on the table. Rebecca Chen, civil rights attorney. Rebecca Chen was no stranger to the legal world. She was famous for cases that others called unwinnable. Abuse of power and violence by law enforcement, especially those involving veterans and people with disabilities. When Rebecca entered the hospital room that afternoon, she didn't bring empty words of comfort. She brought a notebook, questions, and a strategy. She let Robert recount everything from the first command to the moment he was tackled. She asked for details: who touched the wheelchair, who held his hands, who gave the orders, who took his phone, and who said Purple Heart might be fake. Then Rebecca spoke directly, without beating around the bush. "They violated your rights in many ways: unlawful detention, excessive force, violation of the right to film, and clear evidence of racial profiling." She also made another point clear, something many lawyers often avoid. "If you sue, the process will be very long. You'll face interrogation, the press, and painful memories. But if you don't sue, this will be seen as an unfortunate incident, and they'll just keep doing the same thing to others." Robert was silent for a long time. He looked at Maria, who had put her work aside to sit by his bedside. He looked at his arm in a cast. He looked at Purple Heart. Then he said something very softly, but enough to shape the battle ahead. "I'm not doing this just for myself. I'm doing it for the voiceless." 3 weeks later, the lawsuit was formally filed. 4 federal agents were named individually. Management was added to the list of defendants, and a case that had once been called under consideration had now become a full-blown legal battle. And this was just the beginning. The truth is revealed when one incident becomes a system. As the lawsuit officially entered the discovery phase, things began to go far beyond Robert Hayes's story alone. Rebecca Chen didn't just request on-site video. She requested internal emails, training records, performance reviews, and statistics on stops and checks by the involved agents over several years. And the numbers don't lie. Agent Torres had a very clear pattern: an unusually high number of suspicious stops and checks, but a near-zero rate of detecting actual threats. The majority of targets were people of color, people whose appearance didn't fit the stereotypes, and people with disabilities. Internal emails revealed that superiors had praised Torres for being proactive and decisive, despite numerous citizen complaints being dismissed or superficially investigated. Then other witnesses began to emerge. A black doctor recounted being stopped by Torres and his group outside the same building, having her medical bag searched, and being accused of lying about her profession. A Latino businessman described being detained for over 2 hours simply because they didn't believe he could legally own a luxury car and an expensive watch. Different stories, but all following the same pattern. And then, something unexpected happened. An insider number who had been silent for years, decided to speak out. She provided Rebecca's team with internal recordings, in which Torres boasted about intimidating the target and called Robert's case a lesson in respecting authority. Those recordings completely shattered the argument that it was merely a mistake. Now, the lawsuit was no longer a question of who was right and who was wrong in a moment of tension. It had become a much bigger question. How long had a system allowed this to happen? And how many more had been silenced by Robert? When this information leaked out, political pressure skyrocketed. Veterans organizations demanded hearings. The media dug in. Congress began issuing subpoenas. The walls that once protected authority now began to crumble. And the other side understood one thing very well. If this matter were brought before a jury, they would have nowhere to hide. The price of abuse of power, $17 million, and a warning to the entire system. As the trial date approached, the atmosphere in the federal agency's legal chambers was no longer the familiar confidence. Slow-motion video footage of Robert being thrown from his wheelchair, internal emails rewarding proactive behavior despite complaints, witness testimony, and audio recordings that were impossible to interpret. The defendant's lawyers knew all too well what would happen. If the jury saw all of that, a man in a wheelchair, a Purple Heart recipient, 4 federal agents, and dozens of cameras, it wasn't an unpredictable case. It was a legal disaster waiting to erupt. Finally, the decision was made. The case ended with a $17 million settlement for Robert Hayes, one of the largest settlements ever recorded in a case of abuse of power involving a disabled veteran. But money wasn't the only consequence. Agent Samuel Torres lost his badge permanently. His 6-year career ended in disgrace. The remaining agents were severely disciplined. The managers who had turned a blind eye were investigated and forced to leave their positions. The federal agency had to announce mandatory reforms, de-escalation training, bias training, and independent on-site oversight. For Robert, the recovery process continued. A concussion left him with persistent headaches. His broken arm required months of physical therapy. But he made one thing very clear to his lawyer. Money won't give me back what I've lost. But if it makes them stop before they do this to someone else, then it makes sense. Today, Robert's Purple Heart sits in his home office, not as a symbol of war, but as a reminder that sometimes the hardest battles don't take place on distant battlefields. They take place right here in the country you serve. In front of a federal building, at Noah Doazech Shitria, M. And the final question this story leaves is, if a war hero can still be treated like this, then our responsibility as witnesses is to remain silent or to speak out. If you believe that justice only exists when we force it to appear, please share this story. Because silence is what allows abuse of power to continue to exist.